Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I am not a designer, I am not an architect, and preparing the presentation, I decided not to show many pictures in my presentation to take you out of a single way of thinking. I personally have problem with thinking using images, and some people have problems thinking not using the images. So I would like to take you from the comfort zone. The topic of this year's Design Festival focuses on awareness, and it seems a very interesting and important issue nowadays. It is a comeback to an original way of thinking on designing the reality before it became a profession. The word awareness in Polish comes from the same root word as world. So it describes our attitude to the world. If we are an aware person and able to differentiate between humans that are aware beings and objects that are unaware beings, relies in an aware being that is able to transform the world using their skills and transform themselves using the world. The English word comes from the root word that stands for common knowledge. The awareness is based on a common activity and on being aware on what surrounds us.
Będę dziś w związku z tym mówić też o architekturze świadomości.
I will talk about architecture of consciousness. The phrase was first coined in the context of Occupy Wall Street, and it was mentioned by a carpenter who took part in street protests, street rebellions. He mentioned that working on a transformation, you have to create something that can be called the architecture of consciousness. It seems important because it contains awareness, consciousness, and architecture. It shows that our way of thinking has a specific construction, foundations, pillars that support. The awareness can be designed or redesigned in a certain way. An architect, a designer, should not work only on a building, on a structure, but using their consciousness and the way of thinking on the world we want to impact. It was one of the greatest achievements of social science and psychology, being aware that consciousness can be designed by our external surrounding and it is shaped by it. A great discovery by Freud consists in that our everyday consciousness is not a foundation of our existence, that there are hidden matters. Working on our trauma, we can redesign it. There used to be a period in design which seems to be ending, and there are certain harbingers of it. There used to be a period in the design where the architecture of consciousness has been forgotten. The designer was considered someone who throws an object, a chair, for instance, existence into the world, and there is no hidden layer, no hidden construction that tells a lot about the world. One of the designer theorists, Tim Brown, said that in the last decade, the greatest achievements of the design occurred beyond the design. The most significant designs that changed the world, such as Facebook or the internet, were not created in a way that the designer sat with an intention to invent an object, but they are rooted in the need to think about human demands, human requirements in a different way. It started with analyzing whether humans would need a platform to establish and maintain contacts. Only the product, the material object, such as website, was created as a final matter. Everything started with redesigning the consciousness. That is why I would like to emphasize that in the architecture and contemporary design, it is like a small totem with the inscription change, but the change is not an object. Progressive designing means that you have to redesign the world around the object, that you have to have a holistic approach. A question that an architect or designer should ask should be whether we design a change in the world, or do we reproduce what already exists, and do we consider it a single external object or treat it holistically. And as I said, a change is not an object. The other term that I would like to quote is from Abdulmalik Simon, who said that people are infrastructure. This is a new way of thinking about a city. It is interesting because the word infrastructure has so far been reserved for hardware such as pipes, pipelines, wiring, and he shows in his books that certain attempts to function in the world are an infrastructure that is important, equally important. In order to redesign a city, you have to involve people and connect them to other infrastructural networks. You have to think of a building including the functions, or first start thinking about people and then think about a building. Sometimes the phrase "people are infrastructure" is interesting because there are no other material objects than people, and people become infrastructure in this hardware sense. Another example of Occupy Wall Street was a human mic that was a spontaneous design without a single designer. It was a common project, common way of thinking. It was forbidden to use microphones and loudspeakers, and it was justified by noise levels and so on. And people turned themselves into a mic. So a discussion or a lecture in a group of 200 consisted in one person saying one sentence, and the rest was repeating sentence after sentence, and the sound spreaded. So, for instance, I say one sentence, and those of you who sit in the first row repeated, then the others at the back, and so on and so forth, and it would be passed to the end of the building. It was a perfect loudspeaker system without the hardware. It was a perfect example of a design without an author and without a material to be created. we do not think of making an object out of wood, but think how to transform ourselves into a design and how to involve ourselves and other people into the design. A good example from architecture are the buildings by Alejandro Aravena from the global south. This is an example from Chile. The buildings face the challenge that there are no resources in the world and face the problem of slums. On the one hand, it was necessary to minimize the costs to build more buildings, to provide access for better living conditions to a larger number of people, but on the other hand, to use the human potential and encourage people to design space where they feel good. Initially, the design looked like that, but the key to the project, to the design, was that people got one half of the building, and then when they have money, when they feel the need, they were allowed to extend it. So initially they had the base, and it was followed by natural extension. People used their own resources, their own work. Having one half of a building, they were able to extend it. Thinking about changes and design as shaping the changes, the first point that we should start with is looking around what's going on in the world and working on our vision of future. It is interesting that there is Paleo Future building in the US. It is interesting. It is an interesting project. It's a blog collecting photos from the 1950s, 60s, showing the people's vision of future. Looking at the pictures and the photos, we can notice that not much has changed in our way of thinking. Our vision of future is actually quite out of date. Thinking about the future, we use calques from the past, and the future is of paleontological nature. We can observe it in contemporary iconic buildings. This is the famous Gherkin from London. It shows that the buildings are based on the old vision of future, on the vision from the 1950s or 60s, but they do not face the immediate future rooted in what's going on in the contemporary world. Now I would like to tell you about Aaron Schuster's project. You probably can't see what is written in the slide. Schuster works on the old quotation from Andy Warhol, who said that in the future everybody will be famous for 15 minutes. And Schuster says in 15 minutes' time everybody will be in the future. It seems to be the progressive way of thinking about the future. In 15 minutes we will all be in the future. In a sense, thinking about the future in architecture and design must and should be rooted in the future that will come in 15 minutes' time. Actually, it's not true that we are not able to predict the future. Most phenomena that become critical in the 15 minutes or years have already started, but we have to, such as the project related to slums or the crisis, which was actually urban crisis caused by crunch. When we think about them, they should make us think now about the future in a different way. On the one hand, more things are going on, and I have the impression that in Poland, the majority of designs and projects are rooted in the old vision that is obsolete, and we suppose it should come, but will never come. From the Polish perspective, designing or thinking about designing in the Polish context, we should be aware of it. Not only because our vision of future is out of date, but we also should ask why is it obsolete. I don't want you to make an easy move and say everybody is wrong. They think that the situation here will be just like in the West. We should treat the design as a form of our own social therapy and understand why the society has such needs, or why their hunger for consumption lasts for so long. As designers, as architects, sociologists and anthropologists, we should work with the entire society on the social consciousness and redesign it. Aravena, the author from the buildings in Chile, said it should be a do tank, not think tank, but simply working on social visions and specific material and specific buildings. So we have to be aware of the context. The global context is the context of a crisis. Jay Schaffer will talk about it later on. An old model of a flat is devalued. The American dream, saying that everybody will have a house in the suburbs, is no longer effective. Perhaps soon there will be scarcities of fuel, the resources. There will be shortage of resources, and it seems that the vision will not come true because no society will be able to afford it. I don't mean individuals who will be able to afford it, but the general costs would be too high. So we have the symbolic burning house of the American dream. Still, in Poland, there are lots of people dreaming of their own house with a garden. On the other hand, we have a different context looking around the city or of Łódź or any other city. We have scarcities, but huge need for consumption. If having experienced socialism and transformations that the society suffered, it is justified that the Poles want to have more space, objects and more of everything, which is impossible. In the architecture, it results in excellent design that is a sophisticated design of deviations. That is a Google Maps view on a house in Kabaty, which is a district of Warsaw. The arrows mark green areas. This is grass on roofs, and nobody is allowed to enter these lawns. The grass is there to comply with the regulations. However, in the context of living, it means nothing because there is no actual green area. On the one hand, it means it's a good design, but on the other hand, it's bad because if the building is only intended for complying with the regulations, but from the perspective of this goal, someone had an excellent idea. It's not so obvious to think of such minor tricks. The Polish society has a great talent for inventing such bypasses, for finding some ways to bypass the system or to find some unique solutions. It's enough to see Polish allotments, plots of grounds to see the sophisticated design. One of my friends, Agata Nowotna, mentioned in one of the interviews that when she was at a Swedish conference on design, they were enchanted by ladders for cats that the Poles built from balconies on the ground floors, and it shows that we have the ability from the crisis time to create something out of nothing. So redesigning the awareness would mean that we design deviations. It should be transformed into not losing the skill, and it's a social resource to do something out of nothing. Our society knows it, and it should not be rejected, but treated as a certain skill and be transformed into a higher level. It seems that the atmosphere is getting better and better in this sense. Our topic is awareness, and responsibility was the topic of Urban Design Congress. It mentioned a comeback to an idea that an architect or designer is a profession of public trust. It is someone whom the society can trust. They will act on their behalf and for their benefit, that they would not sell their products easily to a property developer that will be a kind of avant-garde. We have closed fenced residential districts in Warsaw, many of them. Someone once started doing them and they became popular because no other option. It's like a vicious circle now. Due to the economic situation and a lack of courage, the initiatives to contradict property developers' ideas, to suggest something new, not to recreate the patterns but become an avant-garde, there are not many examples of that kind. I was impressed by the lecture of Mr. Maczków from Wrocław, which was a good example of an architect who says something and one understands that his profession and his mission of a public trust is taken very seriously. It seems to me that one of the greatest problems and major tasks on the list of perceiving the design in a new sense due to crisis and overpopulation is thinking of residential buildings and how to provide good living conditions to the Polish society. On the one hand, when we look at the list of flats being built in the last years, we can see that many of them were created, not as many as in the 1970s, certainly,
budowało się rzeczywiście
But
zupełnie bez tego kontekstu świadomości.
the
Budowało się tylko
buildings were
budynek,
created
nie
without the
myśląc o tym, jak
context
to
of
będzie funkcjonowało.
consciousness.
Jeden z
A
takich
building was
efektów
created
ekonomicznych,
without
na
thinking
które się
how
to
it
natychmiast
will
przełożyło, to
function.
jest to,
One of the
że
economic
jakby tak naprawdę
results of this
najszersza grupa
approach
polskiego
is that
społeczeństwa to jest grupa, która nie mieści się
the
w żadnym z
group
istniejących modeli,
that
czyli
does not
ludzie,
belong to
których
any of the
nie stać na
existing
to,
models
czyli
is
którzy są zbyt
the
bogaci, żeby
widest
dostać
group.
mieszkanie socjalne
These
od
are
miasta,
people
które
who are
zresztą czy
too
komunalne,
rich
których
to
zresztą i tak
get
brakuje,
a
prawda, i tych
flat
ludzi,
from the
którzy
municipality.
pasują do tych kategorii, i tak też czekają w ogromnych kolejkach, a którzy jednocześnie, prawda, ta
But
klasa średnia czy
this is the
prekariat,
middle
taka
class,
początkująca, która nie może sobie pozwolić na
and
wzięcie
they are
kredytu
not able
deweloperskiego.
to
Zresztą na tym
afford
wykresie, który Państwo widzą na tablicy,
property loan.
to jest wykres, który
The
przedstawia,
diagram on the
czy
slide
pokazuje, z czego zbudowana jest
shows
cena współczesnego mieszkania w
what
Polsce.
a
I
price of
pokazuje,
a
że ponad połowa
contemporary
tej
flat
ceny to jest czysty
consists of.
zysk
It
dewelopera.
shows
To
that
znaczy, że te
more
mieszkania
than a half
są nienaturalnie drogie,
is a property
właśnie ze względu na
developer's
to, że ten
profit.
rynek jest bardzo
The flats
monolityczny i
are
że
so
właściwie nie można
expensive
wybierać
because
spośród
the
tych ofert
market is
i ci
monolithic
deweloperzy mają
and
na to
one
monopol.
cannot
Dlatego
choose
takim jednym z
from the
dutangów,
offers.
który ja bym
One of the
zaproponowała
duties
architektom
that
i
I would
designerom
suggest
współczesnym,
to
to właśnie
designers
myślenie
and
o nowej
architects
mieszkaniówce, która
is thinking about
połączyłaby
new
nowy
residential
model ekonomiczno-społeczny z
buildings that
nowym
would
modelem
combine a new
architektonicznym.
social
Czyli
and
na
economic
przykład,
model with the new architectural
pomyślenie o
model.
mikrospółdzielniach,
Thinking
tak, czyli takiej
about
formie
some
własności, w której
micro cooperatives
grupa osób
where
zbiera się i
a
buduje
group
sobie
of
mieszkania, prawda,
people
które dzięki temu
gathers
mogą być
together to
tańsze, bo
build
nie
a
ma
block
tej
of
połowy zysku
flats.
dewelopera.
The flats can be
architektami
cheaper
czy
because there is no
designerami,
property
którzy też
developer's
muszą je
profit, and they
zaprojektować w
work
taki
in
sposób,
cooperation with designers
żeby to po pierwsze, żeby każdy był zadowolony,
to make
żeby to
everybody
było, jak to
satisfied
się mówi po angielsku, sustainable,
and to
czyli
make it
nie ma na to niestety
sustainable.
dobrego polskiego słowa, co też świadczy trochę o naszym,
It is an English
właśnie o
phrase, and
naszej
actually
debacie,
in
że jeszcze nikt
Polish
nam
we
nie
do not
wymyślił na
have
to
a
dobrego
good
słowa. Bo to
word
nie tylko chodzi o zrównoważony rozwój,
covering
tego się używa, tylko
sustainable
też
development,
o coś, co
but
będzie w stanie
also
właśnie myśleć o tej zmieniającej się przyszłości, czy pracować z czasem. Czyli to, że
thinking
projekt
about
nie
the
kończy się
changing
w momencie
future,
budowania
thinking about the
budynku, ale jest
future,
przygotowany na
that
zmianę funkcji,
a
na
project, a
tą
design does
dalszą
not
pracę
end
po
when
prostu
it's
z
completed,
czasem
but it's ready
i
for
przyszłością.
working in
Dlatego,
future
że
and as time goes
tak jak
by.
mówię, Jay Schaeffer po mnie będzie mówił
Jay
o nowym
Schaeffer
modelu
will
domków,
tell
które
you
mają,
about a
nie wiem,
new
ile, chyba
model
40
of
metrów, czy w ogóle o tym, że idei
houses
mieszkania na
and
40
about
metrach.
the
Czy to
idea
później
of
20 minut, że mam
living on
9
40
czy 8,
square
z tego
meters.
co pamiętam. I z jednej strony jakby to jest idea, która w Polsce
On the one
zupełnie nie jest
hand, it is an
rewolucyjna.
idea that is not
Prawdopodobnie wiele osób siedzących na
revolutionary in
publiczności
Poland.
mieszkało lub
Perhaps
mieszka na 40 metrach.
most of the people in the audience used to live or live on 40 square meters. So it's not the question about area, but the context. The error that modernists made, the error that led to the generation of the idea of modernism consisted in not thinking about the social part. It's not about 40 meters, but how the 40 meters will work with human infrastructure, how it will be maintained and work to make a city nice to live in. In 15 minutes time, we will be all in the future.